Uh, Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Juneteenth celebration for 2024 of the African American Historical Society. Today, we will be presenting on discovering lost communities. And before we get into the program, I'd like to introduce our co-sponsors for this event, the Finkelstein Memorial Library. Maria Vanessa.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being with us. We are so thrilled for this presentation, and we thank our community partners, the African American Historical Society of Rockland.
Okay. I would like to introduce to you now the president of the African American Historical Society, Miss Jamila Brathwaite. Mrs. Jamila Brathwaite.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Claude, for that introduction. On behalf of the trustees of the African American Historical Society, welcome to our Juneteenth, short for June 19th event, in collaboration with the Finkelstein Library. Juneteenth marks the day in 1865 when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced the end of slavery, enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation that, of course, had been issued 2 years earlier. This day is significant because it symbolizes the final liberation of enslaved African Americans in the United States, particularly in remote areas where the news of freedom have been delayed. Over time, Juneteenth has grown into a celebration of African American culture, of heritage and progress, observed with festivities, educational events, and family gatherings. On June 17, 2021, President Joe Biden signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act, making Juneteenth a federal holiday. This legislation was a significant milestone acknowledging the historical importance of the day and honoring the struggles and contributions of African Americans. The establishment of Juneteenth as a federal holiday reflects a growing recognition of the need to confront and remember America's complex history with slavery and racial injustice. And it serves as a day for reflection and education and community building. And I hope that that is what we will be accomplishing here. This Juneteenth, we celebrate not only freedom, but also the courage and resilience of those who fought for liberty and created safe havens for Black communities. Our event will highlight the significant contributions and stories of African American communities from historic places such as Seneca Village to Rockland County's own Skunk Hollow. So let's get started. So I want to tell you a little bit about Skunk Hollow. Many of you have probably heard of Skunk Hollow, but for those of you who don't know much about it, I hope that this will be a little primer for you. How we learned about Skunk Hollow, at least for myself as a member of the African American Historical Society, is through our own co-founder, Dr. Jacqueline Holland. In 1987, Dr. Holland co-founded the African American Historical Society of Rockland County with her husband, Albert Highland. And as president of AAHS, she publicized the history of the St. Charles AME Zion Church for the Historical Society of Rockland County in 1989. She also became an adjunct professor and worked at Dominican College. She developed a course on the experience of African Americans. She began her teaching in earnest at the Orangeburg Elementary School here, where she taught 5th grade from 1958 until 1968. And in 1969, she received an elementary principal certificate. And in 1973, her doctorate in educational administration from the graduate school at Fordham University. She served as principal of Tappan Zee Elementary School in Piermont from 1974 to 1981. And in 1979, she was appointed a trustee of Rockland Community College. Dr. Holland's unpublished writings serve as the foundation for a lot of the work that we do and for what we have learned about Skunk Hollow. So this sign is right now on Route 9W. In 1994, Jacqueline Holland, along with the members of the African American Historical Society, spearheaded the installation of the Skunk Hollow historical sign. The sign tells the story of Skunk Hollow. It also indicates the name that the free Black community actually called it, for the most part, the mountain. It lets us know that the community would thrive for over 100 years. And it talks about some of the principal residents of that community. And so we can be thankful to that early group for this. The origins of Skunk Hollow, or the mountain, begin with a formerly enslaved person named Jack. Like many enslaved people of African descent, Jack had no surname. His mother, Yanachi, was enslaved by John Gessner, and you may recognize that name as a Rockland County name or Bergen County name. And his father, whose name was unknown, was enslaved by the pastor of the nearby Reformed Dutch Church of Tappan, New York. Think about that for a minute. So when Jack was 23 years old, he was sold to a man named Nicholas Gessner, and he was the son of John Gessner, for the price of $200. The Gessners were descendants of Dutch settlers. They had farms in the valley of the Tappan. So about 13 years later, Jack bought his freedom by acquiring a loan from a friend for $100. He paid for his freedom. And once he was free, he worked off that loan by chopping wood. And he was such a hard worker that people attached the moniker Ernest to his name. Jack was Ernest. And so he took that as his last name. And now we know Jack Ernest as the first resident of Skunk Hollow. He was able to work and save $87.50 to acquire 5 acres of land. It was on the top of the Palisades. It was a relative swampy, slopey, rocky bluff that kind of dropped off into a hollow. And so if you're thinking about what that must look like, it does not look like farmland. So these were kind of harsh economic conditions. This was land that whites in the area had used as much as they had wanted for logging and attaining wood. And so they didn't want it anymore. And so they sold it to the free Black people who maintained subsistence farming. They worked as day laborers, and they, did the best that they could in maintaining a life in Skunk Hollow. This is an interesting map. The maps, especially some of the historical ones, are kind of all over the place. You'll see some Skunk Hollow on the New York side. You'll see some on the New Jersey side. Most of the tax records associated with this area are on the New Jersey side. But what we've learned from about Jack Ernest really comes from Nicholas Gessner's diaries that Nicholas Gessner wrote daily about his life and gossip and the weather and bills and whatever else was going on in the Rockland neighborhood community. And this is how we learn of his relationship with Jack Ernest and how Jack Ernest became free and how he became a landowner. There's a lot of stories around why Skunk Hollow was called Skunk Hollow. Some people say that it's because the white community named it after a swampy area. that was called Skunk Hollow. There are others who think it was named after a plant that you may recognize and see around Rockland. But Skunk Hollow ranged well over 100 acres. And after Jack Ernest bought his property, James Oliver, who was enslaved by the Blauvelt family, after Johannes Blauvelt's death, he was freed in his will, and he bought property next to Jack Ernest in 1813. And from that time on, Black families started to move into the area, and the community peaked where there are around 75 to 100 residents in the community, which by that time was known outside of the community as Skunk Hollow. And that community lasted for over 100 years. This is the skunk cabbage plant that I was talking about. That is all over Rockland County and wooded areas. And it was what Jacqueline Holland felt that skunk was the reason why Skunk Hollow was called Skunk Hollow. And we may never know the answer to that one. So Jack was like the largest landowner in Skunk Hollow. He had about 11 acres before he passed away. So that made him a major Black landowner in the area. We talked about there being subsistence farming, but we found that some of the families did own cattle. They had mules, they had sheep, they had pigs, they raised potatoes, perhaps corn. There's plenty of small game, fowl, and fish, of course, with the Hudson River. The men labored for farms for wages. There's also evidence that they participated in the manufacturing of leather shoemaking at the time. They also built boats. They worked in various capacities in Piermont and in Nyack. But by 1841, there was a tragic accident, and Jack was burned in his own house and died in 1841. But William Thompson, who was a young man at the time, was able to buy Jack Ernest's property and continue to grow the community. And here are some of the names that you may know, that you hear, especially like Cisco and Oliver and Thompson, that we hear within our community, some of the major families who lived in the area. This is another map that this is a recent map that indicates Skunk Hollow near the Columbia Lamont Daughtry Earth Observatory, and also gives us an idea of where the Skunk Hollow Memorial marker is. And you can look at a lot of maps and be a bit confused about where things are, but I just thought that one was interesting. Here is Betty and William Thompson. By 1856, a church that was called the Methodist Episcopal Church of Colored People for the town of Harrington was erected. It was also called the Old Swamp Church, and it was the church for the Skunk Hollow community. William Thompson was its minister. After the erection of the church in 1856, the community began to thrive even more so. The enclave of free Blacks maintained stable families with close kinship ties. This is a brief drawing from a book by Reginald McMahon called Jack Was Ernest, and it shows a lot of where they believe a lot of the properties were on the New Jersey side, just at the border of Rockland County. This map is a historical map from 1891 that indicates the Skunk Hollow Church. I drew a red circle and an arrow over to the left side. You can see it just over the New Jersey line. This is the church that was built in 1856. Also within this map, if you look a little further over, I don't know how much in this environment you can see, but this map indicates land owned by a J. Moore. It's believed that that may be John Moore, Rockland's John Moore, who was the first Black entrepreneur in the area who owned a carding and grist mill. More research needs to be done to really uncover if there is a possible link there. So William Thompson passed away in 1886, and the Skunk Hollow community began to wane. The trustees of the old Swamp Church began looking for a new site and began the building of a new African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Sparkill, New York. Jacqueline Holland cites the loss of the community leader, the building of roads, making travel much easier, and the lure of local industry and jobs in Nyack and Piermont as the impetus for the residents moving away from the Skunk Hollow community. If you'd like to learn more about Skunk Hollow, here's a couple of references that we suggest. They're both pretty old. One is by Dr. Joan Gesmar. She's a urban archaeologist. And at the time, she was at Columbia University working on her dissertation, and she began to study the Skunk Hollow area in the 70s. She wrote her dissertation and she published her book, Skunk Hollow, The Archaeology of Social Disintegration in Skunk Hollow, a 19th century rural Black community in 1982. It's a hard to come by book, but I did find it in the internet library. And so you can borrow it only for an hour at a time for some strange reason. And then you have to reborrow. But if you have patience, it's a great way to get the book because it's well over $100, probably about $130, $150 to find a used copy online. But it is a thorough book that tells you about her work in the area, which lasted over 6 years. And then there is a small book by Reginald McMahon. It's the story of Jack Ernest. Jack was Ernest, and this publication comes from Nicholas Gesner's diaries and from tax records and deeds, and he's really doing investigative work and piecing things together. It has some images from the St. Charles Church in it, and is a great supplementary book if you're looking to learn more about Skunk Hollow. So by the 1870s, the construction of Route 9W initiated a decline in the community. By the 30s, the land constituting the core of Skunk Hollow was purchased by the Rockefellers and donated to the Palisades Interstate Park. In 1954, the Palisades Park Commission started to bulldoze a number of the abandoned buildings while constructing the parkway. And now the land belongs to Alpine, Columbia University, Lamont Daughtry Earth Observatory, and the Florence Lamont Nature Sanctuary, and the Palisades Interstate Parkway. Little remains of the original structures. I don't know if anyone has been out there since these books were published. There are some pictures of hikers online who go back there. I hear that there are snakes, and so that will keep me from going back there, but perhaps there will be others who are braver than I who will, want to go on a bit of a archaeological exploration. This is a plate of the Palisades in Skunk Hollow. So imagine living up on that kind of bluff or mountain and really trying to live in that rough terrain, but that's what our Black ancestors did. Although the majority of the residents moved from Skunk Hollow, there are accounts and oral histories that were done during the 80s, and Jacqueline Holland was a part of this, where descendants say that they used those residents in Skunk Hollow as retreats up until 1954 when they started doing demolition. So I do have questions about whether those places were truly abandoned. I think that it was either the Cisco family or the Oliver family. I found one article about it that talked about how they had belongings that were still in those homes that they never retrieved. So abandonment, you know, we're going to put air quotes around that. There were 12,000 artifacts that were collected by Joan Gesmar during the 1970s, and not quite sure where they are. I presume that they are under the care of Columbia University, but it might be something that we want to start looking into the future. So that's just a little bit about Skunk Hollow. I hope that, you know, that may whet your appetite about our communities that are within our own area, within the county, and, you know, just over the border of the county that you may be interested in looking at. We need your help. We'd love to have you come and join us as board members or just general members. You can scan this QR code and it will take you to our membership website. We'll also put that link into the chat during this event. You know, general membership is only $25. A youth membership is $15. A senior is $10. Help us to do our work. It takes a lot to try to uncover this work, this history, and to present it and to do events like this. And so we hope that you will join us in this effort. And lastly, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's here on behalf of the African American Historical Society of Rockland County. Our board thanks you. I'm Jamila Brathwaite, the president. Dana Stilley, the honorable, I might say. Dana Stilley is our treasurer. Holly Zuber Banks, Dr. Claude Brathwaite, the Honorable Tony Earl, Kenneth Jackson, James Johnson, Drusilla Kenzonzi, Dr. Elias Rodriguez, Willie Trotman, Barbara Williams, and Dr. Arlene Klingscale are all board members who help us to keep this work alive and to keep this organization alive. We stand on the shoulders of Jacqueline and Albert Holland, and we hope to continue to do this work and to make them proud. So please join us, and we thank you. And I'm going to turn everything over right now to Dr. Claude.
Thank you, Jamila. And thank you in the audience for coming to the presentation this evening. We heard a little bit about what has happened in Rockland and about Skunk Hollow. At this point in time, I would like to welcome our two speakers, Dr. Cynthia Copeland and Mr. Herbert Seignoret. My contact with the Seneca Village project started in the late 90s. And that's when I first met Herbert, giving a talk at the CUNY Graduate Center. And since that time, I followed some of the progress of this project. And with that, I'll turn it over to Herbert and to Cynthia to tell you about the wonderful work that they've been doing for over 2 decades, going into 3 decades. Herbert and Cynthia.
Thank you. Thanks for dating us, Claude. And a big thank you to Claude for inviting us to the African American Society of Rockland County and also the Feinstein Memorial Library for supporting this work and giving us the opportunity to share a history that has been silenced, a history that needs to be told. Also, a big thank you to Jamila for sharing the story of Skunk Hollow. We actually have connections with Skunk Hollow with the Seneca Village project. Pass it on to Cynthia so she can give you some more.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us this evening. We are excited to always tell the story, the progress that has taken place in our discoveries of Seneca Village. Each year we uncover something new, and we're we're a volunteer group of folks who have been working on this project since the late 90s, and we have together arranged to have what started off really as sort of an academic exchange, a process of inviting students from City College and joining with people at the New York Historical Society and professors over at City College. It just grew and grew as people, especially New Yorkers, as I always say, New Yorkers think they know everything about everything. And when they were stumped by the story of Seneca Village, they couldn't believe that this thing existed in their own backyard, and it just happened to just grow and grow and grow. So we've had members from the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, All Angels Church. We've had historians, we've had politicians, we've had youth members, we've had students, we've had, you know, archaeologists, just an intersectional group of people who have taken a great interest and wanting to participate in one way or another of helping us to learn more about this community that was so important in the 19th century, 19th century New York. And so the other thing I do want to correct, I'm not a doctor, but everybody always wants to elevate me to that status, but I'm not a doctor, but I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. And yeah, an honorary doctor, but the work that I've done though, really to get into those archives, to work with librarians, to work with scientists, to work with community, none of this work is possible without all of those folks to be able to help us to tell these stories. So thank you very much for having us. And as Herbert said, we are connected with the Skunk Hollow story. We're connected by, you know, Joan Geismar. Dr. Joan Geismar is on our advisory committee. So she works with us in telling the story of Seneca Village. Some of the surnames, the Treadwell and Oliver and Cisco, these are names that are connected somewhat to Seneca Village, although we've not been able to make an exact connection. But, you know, it's knowing that we're talking about neighboring communities, that people moved from one location to the next to secure their freedom, really makes us feel that as we continue to dig and make more connections, we know that there have to be some sort of connections to both regions, absolutely. So, you know, that is something that we continue to explore. You know, John and Elizabeth Whitehead, who were people of European ancestry, you know, sort of started the project of having the land that became Central Park and selling the land to people of color and to women. You know, we're wondering if there might be some kind of a connection to, again, that name of Whitehead. Perhaps Whiteheads were part of the abolition communities that existed at that time. So, you know, we have a lot of theories, and we go by these theories because we know that it starts with the hypothesis, and then we start digging and seeing if we can indeed prove our hypotheses. So we still have a lot of work to do, but you know, like everything with history, lots of rabbit holes, you know, you just keep going and digging down the rabbit holes, and you end up going to places where you just can't imagine where you could be. And it can take, especially now that we have documents and records available to us in the digital sphere. I know that Herbert and myself and many others of our committees, you know, end up being up until 5 o'clock in the morning, having started off looking for something at 7 p.m. the night before, and just, you know, we keep going and searching and making these connections. And so it is a big mystery to be able to kind of connect all the historical documents to the stories that we have, but we feel that this is indeed a worthy story, and we just love to connect with people who are like-minded and true folks in the spirit of helping us learn more about Seneca Village. So that said, I think we're going to turn it over and bring up a slide presentation, and we hope that you will enjoy looking at our slides. Go ahead, Herbert.
The story of Seneca Village is one where a community has been silenced. The story of a community has been silenced. A community has been displaced. And how do we empower our communities to give value to these stories, to tell the stories of communities that have been silenced and have been displaced? So it's a way of empowering the local community and the youth to get and seek knowledge and put value in their history. The area where Seneca Village was originally located, if you look at this map, it's an overview of Central Park, and it's an area extending from what 82nd Street would be the southern boundary, up to what 89th Street would be the northern boundary. The western boundary would be Central Park West, or what would be 8th Avenue. And the eastern boundary would be roughly what would be, if you continue 7th Avenue into Central Park, that would be the boundary, the eastern boundary of the area that we are going to explore this evening.
That eastern boundary, just to help you, it sort of it runs parallel to the Great Lawn, to give you an idea of where it could be.
How many of you visit Central Park and explore the park, but never consider that there might have been a history to what existed there prior to the park being built? So I'd like to start off with this article from the New York Herald, August 11th, 1871. And that's from a collection of the New York Historical Society. And it reads, yesterday afternoon, while laborers were engaged in uprooting trees at a new entrance to the Central Park, corner of 85th Street and 8th Avenue, that's around right where the Mariners Gate enters Central Park, they discovered 14 inches beneath the surface, a black rosewood coffin, richly mounted and in a state of good preservation. On the lid was a plate with the engraving, Margaret McKinty, died February 1852, aged 16 years, 3 months, and 14 days. Within the coffin was the body of a woman, decayed almost to a skeleton. At a short distance from the spot, another coffin was found, enclosing the body of a Negro, decomposed beyond recognition. This land was dug up 5 years ago when the trees were planted there, and no such coffins were there at the time. Well, take a minute. And just think about what we have read. What sort of questions would you have of this paragraph, of this article? What information are you getting from it? What sort of questions would you have for the author or the writer of the article? Is everything clear? Do you have any questions? Take a minute to think about it.
Who were they? Where'd they come from? How did those coffins get there?
One, okay. So there are two coffins.
Were there
Anything
other
else?
coffins?
Pardon?
How about the state of the coffins that they talked about? Do you recall? What did they say about the coffin that they
Is there a
found?
difference in the way one is described? There's a detail in who was buried. There's a name, there's an age. The other one, is your name given?
No,
And does the person have a name?
probably, but we don't know what it was.
Or it might not be important for the writer. So maybe take a couple minutes, we can write your questions and we'll come back to you with the questions. So that is from a newspaper article, 1871. So,
Yeah, I would think as a person such as myself who grew up in New York City
Mhm.
and visited Central Park many, many, many times, that I would have wanted to know something about that history, you know, as a young person, that a Black community existed in Central Park. I did start to learn from my dad about a Black community around Wall Street. And that was probably the 70s into the 80s, because he had a seafood restaurant on South Street, 91 South Street. And so he would tell me about Francis Tavern, and, you know, that Wall Street was an area where Africans lived. Interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting because these are the questions that pop up as we're uncovering this so-called Black history that had always been there, but we have been led, the master narrative would lead you to believe that there were no Black people in New York necessarily, and certainly not necessarily landowners, certainly not people who would have these thriving communities that perhaps existed. And so when that information, as Herbert mentioned in the opening, is unavailable, it's erased, it's hidden, you are left to just kind of assume that, geez, you know, you go along with that narrative, and then suddenly there's Harlem and everybody's up in Harlem, and that's when they all kind of dropped in and showed up, right? And so I think that these are, you know, these stories that we're uncovering, whereas once upon a time we didn't know that there had been a free Black community in this space. We're now discovering this in the 90s, right? Maybe people had some inkling of it in the 1970s, but perhaps that's because you were a historian or you were some kind of a social worker or an educator who kind of spoke within your particular discipline and shared information with other people like you who were investigating, but it wasn't necessarily mainstream knowledge. And so that is what's exciting about these times that we're in, the you know, presentation of Skunk Hollow's knowledge of you know, places in Corona, in Queens, and in other locations of 5 Points, all of this stuff, the burial grounds that are coming up and sharing their stories, their bones are telling the stories and making way for people to sort of say, how could we have been so foolish and not even thought about these things, right? So I'll throw it back to Herbert.
Our attempt with teaching the history or sharing the history of Seneca Village is to empower our listeners, so we show process of how we get into understanding that history. This project is a project using a methodology with historical archaeology, where we use historical documents along with an actual dig to give voice to a community that has been silenced. When we think of historical documents, what are some of the documents you might think of? We might think of historic maps, newspaper articles, census records, court records. All these things show the history, and we use this to synthesize and get that information. The history of Seneca Village starts in 1825 with the purchase of lots in that area. And the motivation, we believe, to acquiring lots in that area was because of changes in the voting requirement. What were the changes? In the early 1820s, New York State changed requirements for Black males to vote. They had to own property valued at $250 and be a resident of the state for 3 years. At the same time they did that, the requirement for white males was reduced. That was one of the motivating factors, we believe, that created impetus for the purchasing of the initial purchase of property in Central Park, or what became Central Park. But before we get into that, I just want to give you the context of the period, looking at the population growth of New York City and the exponential growth and its impact on African Americans in the city. And as you look at these numbers, think of issues of race, racism, and its impact of the population numbers on an African American community. So if you look at 1830, you see the population of New York City just under 200,000. Of that, 17,700 are Irish, and African Americans are just under 14,000. If we skip over to, let's say, 1845, we see the population has jumped just to 371,000. Of that, the Irish are now 96,000. African Americans, 12,900. And if we look at the 1855, just when the period when Seneca Village would meet its demise, the population of New York City is 629. Of that, you have 175,735 being Irish, and African Americans, 11,840. What do you notice in terms of the numbers?
They're decreasing.
So the population of African Americans more is decreasing, whereas you have a mustering of Irish and other European descents. New York City at that time is growing exponentially. It's becoming industrialized.
Mhm.
Let's see. A minute. So again, it shows you here, the core cities in Lower Manhattan. And as the population is increasing, the city is moving northwards. Think of the pressure that builds on folks who are African American living in a city where the numbers are stable, whereas the other populations are growing, and what resources are available for them in terms of employment, in terms of housing, and how does a community outside of the city center in Northern Manhattan lend itself to the growth of our community?
I'm sorry, can you ask that question again? I'm sorry.
How does the impact of a population growth impact on the African American community as the numbers remain stable, whereas the growth of a European component of the city is going exponentially? So
Right, well,
here, this is an image of the 5 Points intersection in 1827. Are you familiar where the 5 Points was located?
no, I'm trying to think of, I'm thinking of Atlanta, but obviously,
I would pass it over to Cynthia to go over the 5 Points.
so it looks like the Triangle building
Yeah, one would
in New
think
York
that.
City.
When we think about that triangle building, the Flatiron building, we think about
Right.
that area around 23rd Street, which is where it is
Yes.
today. This
Yes.
area, the 5 Points area in the located in the 6th Ward, which was kind of this notorious space. This place was called the 5 Points because it made a 5-point starlight configuration. The streets that made up the 5 Points community was around Worth, Baxter, Park, Orange Streets, and down in the court area where we are
Yes.
today, right? So down in that area, that was a
Yes.
so-called integrated area where African American and Irish folks were living together. It was a swampy land. There had been this huge pond, the Collect Pond, which was drained so that they could build up some real estate. The African burial ground is just
Yes.
in that area to the south of this 5 Points. In the 1990s, our 20th century, when the African burial ground was re-emerged because it was always there, known on the maps. But when it was there, the excavations, the archaeological excavations that took place included looking at the community of the so-called 5 Points, which had this very notorious history of having gangs and supposedly Charles Dickens wrote about it and thought it was a place where he would never send his mom to go down there because, there was just such hellish behavior going on. And so, and the properties, the housing structures that were built on the site after the Collect Pond was drained, left for very swampy land. And so it wasn't uncommon for buildings to kind of sort of sink into the ground because the land was so soft, and to have the ponds and the springs kind of bubbling up in the basements. People were getting sick. They were getting, dying of, various types of dysentery and tuberculosis and other types of diseases that were the result of being in damp spaces. But the 5 Points was an area where folks were living, as I said, this integrated folks. And then also to the west of the 5 Points was the area that today we kind of call it the Tribeca area. That too was an area where you had African-American folks living. You had the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church was over in that space. You had the Freedom's Journal was being published over in that area. So, that downtown area was definitely a mix of individuals. And often what happened was it was so crowded and overpopulated that it wasn't uncommon for people to say, hey, I think I need to move to a different region where it's a little bit more spacious, a little bit more open, and less populous. And so that sort of thing would happen during this time period. So you start to see people making that shift from the lower section of the city and making their way north to the regions that today we know as where, the site of Central Park is, later Harlem, the Upper West Side. People were, along the way, there was the Tenderloin area, which is sort of in the 30s, 40s on the West Side. And you had these little communities of African-American folks kind of propping up and living together in the West Village, around Broadway. Little Africa kind of made its way from this area of the 6th Ward heading north to about where, Macy's and the Madison Square Garden is today. Those kinds of areas, just to give you an idea of how the area stretched and the different places where you would find significant African-American communities kind of cropping up and being in existence. Okay, Herbert.
If you look at this image and you study it, you notice the way African Americans are painted in caricature, also some white folks, but the central figure seems out of place here. And it shows a density that is trying to give a more negative image of what might actually exist in the community, because they're trying to sell a story and trying to give an image of a community that is dysfunctional. In reality, all what you see taking place in that image is not actually taking place here, but then that is what is being portrayed of the community. Similarly, when we go up to how the Seneca Village area is going to be described, in the city's attempt to move from the crowding downtown, the powers that be decided they needed to create a park and created a smear campaign to denigrate the inhabitants. So if we look at this newspaper article from the New York Times, 1856, we see west of the reservoir within the limits of Central Park lies a neat little settlement known as N Village. The Ebony inhabitants after whom the village is called present a pleasant contrast in their habits and in the appearance of their dwellings to the Celtic occupants in common with hogs and goats of the shanties in the lower part of the park. They have been notified to remove by the 1st of August. The policemen find it difficult to persuade them out of the idea which has possessed their simple minds that the sole object of the authorities in making the park is to procure their expulsion from the homes which they occupy. It is hoped that their removal will be effected with much gentleness as possible. Let's skip over. That's the same article, I just leave another portion. If some of the hogs and goats and other inmates of the shanties in this vicinity do not die of the yellow fever this summer, it is only because Death himself hesitates to enter such dirty hovels. So think of yourself as a New Yorker and reading a newspaper article about a community. What sort of image you get of the people living in that community? They are described in very negative terms. They don't even describe them as they don't even describe them as people, they describe them as inmates. If you think of somebody as an inmate who is not in prison or is not hospitalized, but you're just a common citizen, you see the picture that's been painted. What is the reason for doing this? Is that a true, accurate picture of the community when they describe them as living in common with hogs and goats? Do you think that there are people who might practice animal husbandry, but then by describing them living in common with hogs and goats, you put them at the same level with the animals that they keep. So the consideration for people living under these conditions are not the same. That's just one image used in the attempt of a city to displace the community.
Yeah.
Right,
Looks-
and at this time, I'm sorry, at this time, there are plans to develop this upper region and take the land. So as Elias, I think, was saying that these kinds of campaigns are there to justify taking the land, and that is indeed correct, to get people around, to sort of build into the idea that something better is coming for the greater good, and we need to get rid of those people who are nothing but an eyesore living in these spaces. So let's get rid of them and take that land. I'm sorry, Chris, you were going to say something?
Well, the image I got that was developing when I saw the numbers, when I saw the population numbers, I thought of what we would call today urban renewal.
Mhm.
And that's what it looks like was happening there. It was sort of an urban renewal effort, displacing those folks who were there to make better housing, better environments for someone else.
So you see the newspaper article, the painting is creating an image of different communities that are very negative or stereotyped,
Mhm.
an agenda to get to somewhere. So the population of city is growing and expanding, and the powers that be realize we have to expand the city and grow. So there's the development of the grid pattern of Manhattan, which will come into play when you look at the maps of Seneca Village. There are different controls coming into place. And with all this, communities are being displaced and moved. But what communities are getting displaced? And who's profiting from this displacement and the renewal from these communities?
Mhm.
And Chris, as you say, this idea of urban renewal and urban expansion and development is indeed correct, because when we think about this land mass that the city and the state have agreed to take over, this land from 59th Street to 106th Streets, prior to the development of the park as we know it, there had been the site of the receiving the reservoir. So they had the reservoir because the people in the lower reaches of the city were paying money to get fresh water. And so the water was coming from the Croton Aqueduct and being delivered and, funneled through the city streets underground, through tunnels and all, and sort of landing at the receiving reservoir, which was built in 1842 on the site of sort of where near where the reservoir in Central Park is today. So that was the first space, and there had been another Black community there in the 1840s, and the city took that land so that they could create this receiving reservoir, and then the water continued down to the distributing reservoir, which was located on the site of where the New York Public Library is today, and then the water continued for those who could pay for it. So you already have that as sort of one of the first public works projects that is happening in the city, this massive reservoir. And then later, the idea of, well, the city continues to populate and get bigger and bigger. We need more water, we need more resources. So let's just, we already have the receiving reservoir here. Let's put, another body of water that can connect to that and supply fresh water to the city. So that was another reason to sort of justify taking the land that would eventually become Central Park, if that makes sense. But you're onto something about this idea of urban expansion and urban public works. Sorry, go ahead, Herbert.
The city takes over this land through a process called eminent domain. And I guess most of you are familiar with that process, or you know about it. So it's a process whereby the city or state is going to take over property for the better good of the public and compensate the owners of the property. But it's not a process whereby it's something that happens simply. So the smear campaign, painting a negative image of the community, lends hand to and empowers the leaders to use the process of eminent domain to take over the property. It devalues the property when you use a smear campaign. So something we'll get into when we look at some of the property owners and how they go about arguing the case. At the same time, when the park develops, the property around the park is going to, the value is going to increase. And who owns the property of that, the property around the park versus the people who get displaced. And the value equation is an interesting discussion. Prior to choosing the area that became Central Park as the area that would become the park for the city had chosen Jones's Wood prior to that. But Jones's Wood was not occupied like the area that was that became Central Park, but it was owned by white families who fought the city when they tried to take over that property for eminent domain. So rather than use Jones's Wood, they switched focus and used the area that was centrally located, occupied by mostly people of African descent and people who did not have the financial resources to fight the city in court. So here's another example describing the community and see how that differs from the previous one. That's from the New York Daily Tribune, August 5th, 1853. The laying of the cornerstone of the first African Methodist Episcopal Church of Yorkville was laid yesterday. Shows you the address is situated in 85th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue. The sermon on occasion was preached by the Reverend Christopher Rush, superintendent of the African churches, who also laid the cornerstone. His text was a part of the 6th verse of the first chapter of the first epistle of Peter. The box which was deposited in the cornerstone contained a copy of the Bible, a copy of the hymn book of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in America, a copy of the discipline of the same church, a letter with the names of the 5 trustees of this church, and a copy of the Tribune and one of the Sun. The building will be 22 by 14 size, will be built of wood and painted white. The basement of it will be a schoolroom for the education of colored children. Goes on to say towards 50 colored families reside in the neighborhood of this church, and there are 35 members in this society, and the congregation usually numbers about 100 persons. Circuit preachers of African Methodist Church will supply the pulpit. So here we get a description of one of the churches in the community. As Cynthia mentioned previously, there were 3 churches in the community. There was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Union Church, and the All Angels. Cynthia, you want to give a description of some of the churches?
Sure. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church is currently sort of the sister church that exists today on 137th Street up in Harlem. So they had a connection to Seneca Village. All Angels Church is an Episcopal church that is connected to the St. Michael's Parish, and that St. Michael's Church continues to, St. Michael's and All Angels Church are churches that continue to have a lasting existence in Manhattan. And all the African Union Church was a church that had a presence, but kind of disappeared. It had been located down on 15th Street and 7th Avenue in the Chelsea area and then made its way up to this place that became Central Park. All of the churches seem to have had some forms of burial cemeteries that were there, which is probably how they all ended up being in those locations, because as they got when they were in the lower sections of the city, eventually due to the yellow fever epidemics and the other types of diseases that were happening, the churches were told that they could no longer bury their dead in the lower sections of the city because the impact was just so great. And so it was considered that being in the out in the countryside and out in the areas where the so-called nuisance industries, like the bone boiling plants and the tanning spaces where people were dying, could dye their cattle, etc., where you had people living in those areas and those nuisance industries in those spaces, you could bury your dead there. And so these churches started to petition to have burial sites. And then it's one of those things, when you have cemeteries, you want to have churches. And when you have the churches, you're building up communities. And so it is our belief that that is one of the reasons why we were able to have this cluster of churches that were there. I have to say, when we were doing our research, we really relied heavily on the white All Angels, St. Michael's Episcopal Church documents, because their documents are still extant. They are held, they are precious, they are locked up in safes. So as opposed to the ubiquitous fire that sort of follows African American places. There's a fire, things get burned, things get lost. People supposedly don't appreciate, through the movement, these precious materials often disappear. But in the case of All Angels Church, we got a lot of information about who the people were that lived in Seneca Village, what the relationships were, in terms of looking at the sacraments that were administered, the baptisms, the marriages, the births and deaths, etc. It provided us with great information. And so we were grateful to have that particular, or those documents available to us. And, All Angels Church, again, still exists. It's up on the Upper West Side. If you know where Zabar's, that's a landmark just behind Zabar's, is where the All Angels Church still practices and has their church.
So you get a sense of the community in contrast to some articles, but the city decides it's going to go ahead and through eminent domain takes over the property. But there's a resistance. So you have example of one of the owners. And Cynthia, would you like to mention something about Andrew Williams?
Sure. So Andrew Williams was one of the earliest residents of Seneca Village. We sort of call him the godfather of the community. He was a bootblack. He shined shoes for a living, and later was able to move into the profession of carting that had once been closed off to Europeans, where you would haul garbage and lumber and furniture and just things around the city, but you needed to have a license for that. And African American men were shut out of that area. But by the time Andrew Williams is leaving Seneca Village, or as the community is being raised, he's been elevated to the status of a cartman. Andrew Williams was there from, he purchased his first lots. He bought 3 lots of land for about $125. He is there in the 1820s, and he remains in the community until the 1850s. Ultimately, when the community is raised, we were able to actually find one of our advisory committee members, Eric Washington, was able to find his deed his will. And we were able to see how he wanted to distribute property and land to his family. He ends up being in Queens moves to Queens in the late 19th century. And that's where we find him. And we have since gone on to find out more about, we found descendants of Andrew Williams a few years ago. One of his great grands that's sort of connected, not a direct connection, but through marriage is connected. And she reached out to us and said she thought she was part of this family and provided us with some information. And Cal Jones, the late Cal Jones, was able to work with this woman, Ariel, to help us find more of significant connections to the Williams family. So that helps us to keep the story alive and tell this story. And we're excited about the find and have made a real connection with the Andrew Williams, the fourth and his family. And they continue to work with us as we try to find out more about the community. So give it back to Herbert.
And this affidavit, this is Andrew Williams going to court to say that the value that you give my property is less than what is valued. So here he describes the location of this property. Says Andrew Williams, the owner of lots 22, 23, and 43 in block 786. And as you know, because New York City is in a grid pattern, there are lots, there are blocks, and within each block there are lots. Line between 85th and 86th Street objects to the report of the commission on the ground that the commissioner has not allowed the said Williams a sufficient sum for the aforementioned said lots. They have allowed him the sum of $2,335 when he, William, declares said lots with the house at $4,000. And he goes on to argue his case that he has been offered the sum of $4,500 and refused that. So here the city is offering him something and he's saying, no, my property is valued more than what you're offering me. So, again, some of the documents we look at are census records in addition to cost records. And here you can see Andrew Williams again, and it gives the location of his house, the type of house, but also the family members highlighted in yellow. And this is just one example of the information and files within the census record for 1855. As you can see, it lists the houses based on visitation, describes occupation, whether folks are black or white. If you're white, it's not indicated, but if you're black, it's indicated. And what we got also, this is from the All Angels Church, recordings of marriages, deaths, baptism. Again, looking at this documents, if you look at population mobility, you can see from these documents that we look at that the community is very settled, that people who are there from the early 1820s are still in 1850s. Unlike other parts of the city or other communities where folks tend to be more transient. Because people have settled there for a long time, you can look at the church records and see sponsorship, who might have been a godfather for somebody, and look at that in relationship to the historic map and see the relationship and the building of community. Look that quickly. So this is one of the maps we use. This is Central Park condemnation map. And this is the series of these maps. This is just one example showing one of the areas that are populated. So if you look, this one is from 82nd Street up to about 18th to 85th Street, from 7th Avenue to 8th Avenue. If you look closely, you can see the buildings are described in terms of the dimension, the material they're made of, whether it's a frame house, number of stories. If you look here, this one is the All Angels Church. It's off center. This one is the Wilson family. That's where when we had an archaeological dig, that's one of the sites, that's one of the areas we dug in. Now you notice when the area described it very negative terms, but if you look at this, you can see the buildings are laid off within the Manhattan street grid pattern. For the most part, if there are one or two outside, that there are exceptions, most of them are within the Manhattan grid pattern. Why might that be so? Look, I'll just go back to this quickly. If you notice, this is a marker. This is a surveyor's marker. So when the city developed the grid pattern, as it moved northwards, the city laid out where avenues and streets would be laid. So this was laid out prior to houses being built in that area. So when people build their homes, they built it within where they knew the avenues and streets would be built, so that they would, when the street would be actually built, that they would be within the confines of their property, not within the avenues and street.
And as Herbert was saying, so much of what we did with our work was through historical archaeology, as you all know, with Skunk Hollow and other places as folks who are interested in uncovering these histories. So we really did rely heavily on the sources, the resources that were available to us. This particular map, this condemnation map, was so useful because in addition to identifying the locations of the structures that were on the lots at the time of the determination of taking the land by eminent domain, we have the dimensions of the structures that are there, but we also have the names of the individuals. And prior to finding this map, we didn't necessarily know all the names of, the folks who were there. There was a scattering. So when we found this map, it was easier for us to be able to corroborate the title deeds. We went back to the title deeds and we were able to see over the years who had lived there. And in some instances, you had families that were there from the 1820s till the very end. In other instances, as we did sort of random samplings from the 1830s, 1840s, et cetera, you could see that different people had lived on the sites, took down, put up structures, took them down. Sometimes there was just land that was available, but no structure. But what you're looking at here is pretty much what the area looked like at the time of the city's determination to take the land. They had to survey the land, they had to find out who lived there, they had to give the title, and then they had to come up with a form of compensation for these individuals as they're taking this land by eminent domain in order to build something that supposedly would bring more joy and be of greater use to the greater public, as opposed to this small group of folks who, again, had been denigrated through the smear campaigns of the newspapers that existed. This particular map also helps to deny and decry what the folks were saying as the folks living in dirty little hovels, when we found that people lived in 1- and 2-story framed houses. There were barns, there were stables, there were sheds. Of course, there were some shanties as well, but for the most part, it was a very well-established community with those churches, the greenhouses, the green spaces that made for a community, schools that were under construction or already in existence.
And associated with each church would be a burial ground.
Mm-hmm.
This is the sale of Elizabeth Gloucester's house and lots. It's all Angels Church, and just keep over this quickly. It's just giving an example of what life was like for African Americans in that period, so you get a sense of employment and how they might have been depicted. And although we know New York City was free, it's New York State ended in 1827, but there's always the issue of somebody being free, possibly being captured and sent down south. So here's an anti-slavery almanac. A Northern freedman enslaved by Northern hands. Just to give an example, that's from November 20th, 1836. Peter John Lee, a free-colored man of Westchester County, New York, was kidnapped by Tobias Whitno, Ike Wadi, and John Leon, and Daniel Dinash of New York City, and hurried away from his wife and children into slavery. One went up to shake hands with him, while the others were ready to use the gag and chain. So, see Emancipator, March 16th, May 4th, 1847. This is not a rare case. So even though one is free, there's always a possibility in New York City in that period. So you get a context for why a community might want to stay together in an area where they feel safe in numbers. Whereas the rest of the city is growing and they might feel isolated in that community, there's safety in numbers and there's community.
And the same types of jobs and activity, because we're on the in this area that is open and green spaces, just as we were learning from Jamila about the types of work that was going on in Skunk Hollow, you would have similar work going on. People were raising sheep and goats, and people were shining shoes, and people were, hauling garbage, and they had educators in the communities as well. They were growing things. So, there's definitely skilled labor and, working class folks who are doing things in order to be able to survive and live in that self-determined community of what was known as Seneca Village.
Bear in mind also the Hudson is not too far away, so the Hudson is also a resource in terms of oysters in that period, fish. So that's something we explore in terms of the foodways of the community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Towards the latter part of Seneca Village's existence, there was the introduction of folks from Ireland coming in to live, but most of them tended to live on the periphery of the community. And the All Angels Church was a mixed congregation of both white and black. And some of the white folks were Irish. And this was given an example of how the Irish were satirized in that period and issues they had to deal coming into New York City as new immigrants. And if you can look at this article, this image, and also the description trying to denigrate the community, the way the folks of Celtic occupation in the city are described. So the city goes ahead and takes over the area for eminent domain and starts the construction of Central Park. And in its construction, there are certain areas excavated, destroyed. Certain areas are filled. So as archaeologists, areas that are excavated, that history would be destroyed. But areas that would be where fill is used, that would preserve whatever archaeological remains that would be in that area. So that we looked at the construction records to try and determine where might have been excavated, where might have been filled, in addition to using coarse soil quarries to get a sense of what was brought in as fill and where might have been excavated. We'll pass it back on to you, Cynthia.
Sure. In the 1990s, as I mentioned, the story of Seneca Village is becoming popular, where it once had been maybe just a footnote somewhere here or there. This in collaboration with the discovery or reemergence of the African burial ground, as mentioned earlier. Historians are starting to look and think about the stories of these places, these hidden communities. And Roy Rosenzweig and Betsy Blackmore wrote the book, The Park and the People, which kind of launched the greater interest in this community. They looked at the whole idea of the making of Central Park, what was the history of it. And for so long, people thought that this was this man-made, this place just kind of came and existed the way it is, and that they weren't thinking about it so much as being a man-made space. And stories prior to the telling of this story, the Park and the People, were such that people didn't know that there were, 1,200 people or 1,500 people that lived in this pre-park expanse. And if they did, they just thought that they just disappeared and just left so that this could happen. And so putting on their investigative hats, historical hats, the team of Rosenzweig and Blackmar started to look back at the historical documents. And, they noted that, there's a richer story and that story needs to be told, and that there is indeed a pre-park history. And so as a result of their doing research at the New York Historical Society and other repositories throughout the city that held these historical documents, the Historical Society played a big role in helping them find maps and newspaper accounts, et cetera, images. And so out of that came this exhibition that started back in the 1990s. I was the co-curator with Grady Turner. And it was this really amazing discovery, as I mentioned, and the exhibition was supposed to be up for about 6 to 9 months, which is sort of typical for an exhibition. Well, this kept getting extended and extended because people just wanted to learn more about it. And as a result of sort of reimagining what the space looked like, because we really were limited to historical documents and they're not necessarily very sexy in telling a story. So, we had to create a space and environment to help people to imagine what this place was like based upon the research that was there, out of which came this idea of, we're so close to finding this information. And anytime you would walk in the park, particularly after a rain, objects, shards would sort of surface and bubble up to the surface. And so we had gone out, my colleagues and I had gone out and we were developing walking tours and programming at the Historical Society to help to enliven the story. And one day out with teachers after a rain, we uncovered all of these artifacts that, it was really kind of amazing. It really felt like the ancestors wanted their story told. And so these items were collected and very haphazardly, not in a very organized way, but the artifacts, that's when we started to forge this relationship with the City University, with Herbert, with Diana Wall, the archaeologist, Nan Rothschild, later Meredith Lynn. And we just sort of formed this organization, this advisory board, and we just said, we want to find out more. And even in the exhibition, we raised the question of, we've got these historical documents. Wouldn't it be great if we could do an archaeological dig? Now, we know that that is like a crazy idea and almost an impossibility in New York City. But after a lot of years, we were able to finally get out there and do the excavation, which took place 13 years ago. And it's so funny because this morning, when I woke up on my iPhone, I had, how they pop up those memories? Well, I got the memories of, 13 years ago, and they were the memories of us doing our excavation, starting our excavation in Central Park. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. And so clearly we were meant to have this conversation with you today, because those images popped up on the phone, and I sent it to some of the former students who helped us with it. And one of the students wrote back to me and said, oh my gosh, the archaeological dig is a teenager. And it was so anyway, we're now going to get in, because we're running out of time. We realize this and we get passionate about the backstory, but we really want to bring you to the current story, the ideas of the excavation. So we're going to go through these slides, kind of quickly, but to let you know that this is where we are. So Herbert, take it away.
Give you an expression of how we get the work done. This is just an overview of the area that we're working in. And over this is this one of the historical maps. As you can see, this are several plates. So this is I first showed you just one plate, so you can see we're putting a couple of plates together. And then we digitize where the historical structures were located. So when we go in the park, we have an idea of where we look and what might have been located in that area.
Herbert, can you go back a second and just kind of point out with your cursor the kind of area where we kind of focused our dig? And just sort of circle around All Angels.
Angels Church.
And these two areas over here, right? So this was the general area that we explored.
That was in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
when we had the field school with the college students.
So you can see it wasn't that big of an area, but we uncovered quite a number of artifacts and stories. I'm sorry, go ahead, Herbert.
Yep, that's preliminary work. So this is just getting core samples before we actually did the field school. Again, working with students.
Doing our soil coring.
So you can't just go in the park and start digging. You need permission. So here, luckily, we had documentation. So we did not get arrested by the park police. So this is doing non-invasive archaeology to get in the use of a ground penetrating radar. It sends a signal below the ground surface and we look for anomalies, and we try to correlate these anomalies with historical structures. So quickly. So here, this is the images from the field school. Here, one of the students is doing mapping. That's when we actually started doing the test pits. When we dig, we screen limit the soil that we dig, and the soil goes below and artifacts remains on top. Archaeology is destructive, so we have to take careful notes and drawings, photographs of where we work, so we can correlate artifacts and features with historical maps and areas. Because we work in Central Park and the park is heavily used in the summer, on weekends we dug from Monday to Friday, and we had to backfill the soil on Fridays. So here we would use the plastic and refill it with the soil that we dug, and then we'd have to fence it and also make use of security to be on site. The artifacts were taken to the lab at City College, and here students are cleaning, mending artifacts, and putting this information in database also.
Cataloging, dating, yeah.
Let's give an example of one of the families, the Wilson family. Just give you an image of the foundation wall for the Wilson family's house. That was a frame structure, 3 stories. And you never think that you'll find a foundation wall from the 19th century in just below the surface in Central Park.
And just to give you a sense of what the students had to do while they were out there, if we encountered roots from the trees that were like 1/4 of an inch or more, we could not cut them. We had to work around them. So we had to use all kinds of tiny tools to sort of painstakingly go down layer by layer as the students would document. They would draw images, they would identify the different soil levels that were that we uncovered, just so that we had a real meticulous record of what was happening. So here's an example of what that would look like. Working around the rocks.
This is one of the artifacts, is leather shoe for a child.
And when the shoe was uncovered, there really was a pause among the participants, the students, because it was just such a personal item to think that somebody's foot was inside that shoe. One of our participants was actually moved to tears when this was uncovered.
For example, some glass shards, ceramic shards, bone toothbrush handle.
Toothbrush handle.
It's just the bricks layout, the dimension of the property. That's Wilson's, and Wilson was a second for the All Angels Church.
And looking at Madeline inside the pit, you can see that we're not that deep beneath the surface, but deep enough.
And this is the crew for that summer. That's when we had an open house. some of the board members.
Mhm. I think that's it.
Yes, and then
Herbert, can you just go back one slide? Sorry. I just wanted to point out that Ariel Williams as a descendant. Oh, well, if not, that's okay. So this is Ariel Williams, and she is the descendant of Andrew Williams, who was one of the first resident of Seneca Village, and the late Cal Jones, who was just so instrumental in helping us move our process forward to be able to do the archaeological excavation, working with the Central Park Conservancy and the New York City Parks and Recreation Department. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Herb and Cynthia. I think we have time for a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I tried to answer some of them in the chat.
quick question. What is the state of the artifacts? Where the artifacts housed?
the artifacts are held at the New York City Archaeological Repository. I'll share the website with you in the chat so you can get an idea of.
Okay.
If we go back to this, we started off with this newspaper article, and you had a number of questions after you first read this. Do you have your questions been answered, or do you have more questions?
I guess you've answered.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'd like to know what did you discover that maybe you didn't expect? What really like blew your mind in this whole process?
Several things. Finding a foundation for a structure so close to the surface and in good condition. That's not something I expect to find.
And for me, it was finding the sort of like the original soil of the land that people walked on, because the park, in order to build the park, they had to bring in landfill, fill up areas. And so as we went down into one of the locations, we were able to find what we thought was the original soil, and the way in which the artifacts that were left to rest for us was just sort of beautifully laid out. It's like they set the table for us to be able to see that. So that was really quite moving. And again, that shoe was really quite an astounding find.
Do you think that the conservatory will allow you to do more digs, or is this it?
Well, let's put it this way. It took us about 12 years before we could even get started with the dig. That whole process took about 12 years between getting the permits, getting the trust, going through the preliminary work. So, you know, we're all a lot older now, and, you know, getting on our knees and digging in that ground. I don't know if we can, you know, like, oh, my back, you know, we'll be out there with walkers and possibly doing that. But hopefully, I mean, there's still many areas and a lot of unanswered questions. It would be great if we could identify, you know, one more area and get out there and do it, but I don't know if that's actually realistic.
If it was done, it'd be something limited, and it would be something to show the process of how archaeology is done, but also getting the history of the community, trying to empower students to see how historical archaeology can be used to tell stories of communities that have been silenced. Linking it with education, there had to be a strong education component with it.
I will say, when we were out in the park that year, that summer, it was amazing to be able to use the park and the work we were doing as an open laboratory educational space. People just stopped and wanted to know what was happening. We were able to have young kids kind of help us sift the soil, and they got excited about this idea of urban archaeology and what, what does that mean? When we were able to have our open house and hold the open house, so many people came out because they were just so curious. So it really was just great to be able to help people to understand the significance of where they live and to be curious about the learning that goes behind this, whether it be the historical learning, the geological learning, I mean, there's an intersectional approach to doing all of this work, which is what I think is so exciting about the project itself.
I have a question.
Colette, Cliff had a question?
Yes,
Cliff, go
yes.
ahead. Cliff, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for this has just been fascinating. I would love to use some of these slides and old maps and so forth in my classes. I teach at Syracuse University, and I am wondering, is there a mechanism for being able to get some of these slides for use in class? And also, will this information that you presented this evening be published in a book, in journal papers, and so forth?
We have a lot of people writing papers. We're sort of all over the place with that. So yes, there is information. Papers have been written and presented at archaeology conferences, at historical conferences. There have been individuals who have taken it upon themselves, who have been interested in the story of Seneca Village. Sarah Cedar Miller is the Central Park historian. She just published a book. Nan Rothschild and Diana Wall have and Meredith Lynn have written. So we have bits, they're just all over the place. So and in terms of your question about access to maps and things, you can contact Herbert and myself and we can perhaps get them to you, but you could also go, Herbert dropped the
my email. Yes, you can send me an email.
email.
I'll send you, I'll share my material with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is terrific.
And
Really,
and the email address for the laboratory where you can look through and see the objects that have been collected and belong to the city of New York. It's at that repository is also in the chat.
excellent. Thank you.
Colette, I think you had a question.
Right?
Yes, very quickly. I had my great grandmother was a Whitehead, and we're from Guyana. And I'm just wondering, in terms of Rockland, I've not heard that name relative to Rockland, or New York. And I would just like to get some more information if anyone knows of any Whiteheads. And just one other thing, I went to high school with a Gloria Treadwell. So I noticed her name, her last name, who I believe is an attorney living in Brooklyn, probably retired now. So it was just interesting to see those names pop up.
Well, we should all talk and dig in our attics and our Bibles, family Bibles and things of that sort to see if we can make the connections, because we are, we continue to, that's one thing that we're dedicated to, try to find the descendant communities. So let's keep talking.
Okay. Thank you so much. Jamila, anything you
I'm
got?
sorry. One more thing.
One more question.
We have one of our professors on the team, Meredith Lynn, has been working with some folks, some other professors at Bard and Barnard, and we're creating an interactive map that is a 3D simulation. It's a 3D map, and we, it's all, imagine this, imagine that, but it's based on the maps that we have And we're going to be doing a soft launch of that map this weekend for there's Seneca Village. I mean, there's Juneteenth in the park at Seneca, on the site of Seneca Village. And there will be a soft launch of that 3D simulated map this weekend. And we're continuing to build and add things so that it's more interactive. And we hope to do like a formal launch hopefully in the fall, maybe around Seneca Village Day, September 27th, when the first property was sold, bought and sold. So just again, be on the lookout. I think Herbert just dropped another link in the chat for you all to be able to see that. So there's still a lot of activity going on. We filmed our process while we were in the field, but of course, you know, it takes money to make documentaries and it takes a lot to do that. But, you know, we are still hopeful that maybe one day we'll be able to actually share the story of the excavation, because, you know, just looking at two-dimensional images doesn't do it, you know, the service that, you know, if you actually saw what was happening as we were in the ground digging. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to do that as well.
At the core of what we do is getting messages out to students. So pedagogy is very important. Just a quick acknowledgement to Alan Feinberg, Professor Emeritus from City College.
Yeah.
Hi, Alan.
It's there.
Just
show your face. There you are.
I mentioned Alan because we worked on a project at City College many moons ago, and pedagogy was very important in how we work with students. So using Paulo Ferreira's work was a major core of what we did. So I've learned from that process in how we don't just tell a story, but then we try to get, when we generally work with students, we let them use the primary source material. Rather than tell them a story, we pass on the maps, the census records, and they decipher that work, and they come back together and share the material. And we serve as more or less guides and facilitators so that they understand and analyze that material. And this is a way of empowering students to learn about the past.
And it's a way for us to connect with you all, again, through the work that you're doing, the Skunk Hollow connection, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory is, you know, also part of our experience of doing the work as we did the surveying work, the ground penetrating radar. So there are a lot of connections that we have, and we should continue to all work together on these.
And Claude has always been a major supporter of what we do.
Yay.
When we had to print posters or needed help, I was always run to Claude to print something for quick. Thank you, Claude.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. Please let's keep the connections, and let's continue this work. Thank you for an extremely informative presentation. We really appreciate you. And Claude, why don't you close this out?
Okay, thank you, Herbert. Thank you, Cynthia, for making it this evening to give this talk. It's always refreshing to see. And also I'd like to thank the audience who stayed around with us to enjoy this Juneteenth celebration. And again, thank you. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Good night,
Thank you.
all.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you very much.